Mark Boyle, who is a historical and cultural geographer from the Department of Geography here, to just comment upon some of the threads and possible connections, pose a few questions, but we really want to allow for a bit of a discussion. So rather than a formal talk, he's just going to informally mention a few things. And I think we have most of our panelists up in the front, so feel free to respond and jump in as you feel fit.
I was going to sit down, but I guess if Jerry's filming, I'm small enough to start with. If I sit down,
stand on the chair.
I'll be invisible altogether. Yeah. I'll keep this brief because Karen says we do want some time for discussion. I'd like to congratulate all the speakers this morning in 7 very interesting talks that I had the pleasure of reading over the weekend, as well as hearing today. Therapeutic Landscapes was the theme of the first session, and I'm very interested in this concept from the context of medical geography. That's the vantage point in which I would be arriving at the notion that landscapes in some way interrelate with debates on healing and therapy. Of course, within geography, Will Gessler, a mathematician by origin, but a leader of the social and cultural turn within health geography, has been very active in pioneering this idea. It's his notion that, I guess, would inform my understanding. Therapeutic landscapes, landscapes which in and of themselves have healing properties. The production of landscape as an activity, a craft that is in itself therapeutic and health-related consequences, and also the location of therapy, where therapy takes place, and the importance of the spatiality of therapy and its effectiveness are all themes which I think are important, and which in different ways cropped up through the various talks. Rebecca's talk was absolutely brilliant. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and really enjoyed looking at your website and reading your stuff over the weekend. It's creative, practical, lateral thinking, novel, and I think it gives us all sorts of ideas for research projects that we might adopt also. I see it as layered with landscape in many ways. You're creating opportunities through creating temporary or transitory landscapes to encourage and foster a certain degree of healing by allowing people to vent and ventilate stories that are otherwise hidden and lost to history. I guess the question I would have is, did you find in the course of giving permission and fostering an environment to release certain kind of stories that are submerged and are cathartic for sure when released, that you could also be stirring up stories that might have had more, perhaps the psychoanalytic terms, more serious consequences or more damaging in some respects? I want to think of all sorts of fear of spaces that I would have in the Dublin context or in Glasgow that have stirred up, if I was to map, I'm sure it would be hugely cathartic and healing, but also stir up some pretty deep-seated emotions that are submerged. So is there another side perhaps to the venting and ventilation of stories? Ronan's paper was dealing with more fixed sites, more historical sites, or are they more fixed sites of landscapes that are therapeutic? And I think it's part of his broader cultural histories of water, and water as a healing, water as being invested with a number of healing properties. And he points out, as he did in his book, 3 ways in which these landscapes work. They work in material senses and symbolic senses and metaphorical senses. And I think you refer to that as the body, the mind and the spirit in terms of the contribution of, in this case, holy wells in the healing of particular conditions. I would ask Ronan again just to think a little bit about those spaces in a secular context. Ireland, as we all know, as many countries are, is at the forefront of pretty aggressive secularism. So what happens to the piety and practices that surround holy wells and sacred spaces as those spaces get swept along on the tide of secular movement? And is it the case that holy wells function in the same way as they have historically, even for a subset of the population? What does secular trends do to the utility and mobilisation of holy wells as potentially therapeutic landscapes? And finally, Victoria, again, excellent paper, and that followed on very well from Roland's paper. Deals with the monuments around Newgrange and Joseph Boy's theories as to how, I thought that the quote was excellent, Victoria, that there are perhaps no such a thing as a therapeutic landscape, but there are people who secure therapy through the act of actively engaging with those landscapes. And this is a process of engaging and breathing your life into and reclaiming sacred spaces of the past that have been lost through time with the erosion of mythology and changes in the landscapes and so on. And I was quite interested in the way you referred to using Boy's work, the hunger and the thirst to reclaim those deep sacred spaces that are often submerged and lost, as a movement against history, if you like, or a movement against the tide. I think you referred to it as working in the opposite direction. And I'll just ask you to think a little bit, or perhaps to comment, if you wish, on the notion that the reclamation of sacred, deeply buried sacred spaces is often working with the tide, or working in the right direction, as well as working against the tide. These spaces are not always lost, and as probably many of you saw coming through Dublin Airport, we mobilise myth and commodify myth in a very important and real way as part of our tourist industry. In fact, the past has never been more salient or present in the context of Ireland. So, thinking a little bit about the mission of working against the tide or working with the tide, and the differences that differences of working in those environments make to the project of reclaiming deeply sacred pasts that are deeply buried. Second set of talks, and I'll be brief because they do, I think, come as a really nice package of talks. And I have to first of all congratulate the colleagues from the Duncan of Johnson College of Art and Design in Dundee. They're obviously pioneering a kind of interesting set of debates around groundedness. And the fact that students who unbelievably are in the course of their undergraduate programme show up and present such thoughtful and reflective pieces today is immensely to your credit. So well done, you're beating the competition simply by being here and doing such a great job. Mainly introduced us to the notions of groundedness and rootedness. And I think what I like about these is that we in geography are wrestling continuously with this notion of these kinds of notions and their normative consequences or their normative significance. On the one hand, one wants to be rooted, one wants to be grounded, especially in the restless world of late capitalism and the continual, perpetual transformations of landscapes. A sense of rootedness and existential and ontological security is a much sought after prize. One only sees in Obama's trip this week the claims that are made for the central importance of Obama's rootedness in an Irish context. It simply can't be, his past simply can't be unmappable or unknown. The notion of a tumbleweed is, it seems to be morally and politically damaging in some contexts. But also, as Mary noted in the talks, some of the talks noted, there is a very real issue surrounding the incarceration in place or the claustrophobic senses that come from groundedness and rootedness. I should know this personally, I've caused regularly to ground a certain young child of mine. And the word in our house of groundedness takes on altogether different meanings from perhaps the notion of security and so on. So we're wrestling with this idea of place as a progressive notion, or place as an incarcerating and stifling and suffocating notion, and whether being rooted and anchored and grounded in specific milieu is productive to human self-flourishing. So these concepts in this debate and the way they're reasoned through art, I think, gives geographers cause for reflection and gives me cause for reflection in terms of how we might draw upon interdisciplinary work think about that tension. Kelly's talk raised interesting questions around persona, and from picking you up right clear, I think the very crucial point you're making is that whilst we all, as do places, as I know from Glasgow's celebrating its role as European City of Culture in 1990, places like to present personas that perhaps then when they stand back in reflection and think about the true essence, or what is the real Glasgow, the real person, then become questioned. But you're questioning the possibility of a God's eye view on an essence to a place or to a person in the first instance, and particularly looking at film as, in fact, mediating any claims to some kind of essential character to the person. So there are no personas, and even trying to think about persona reflects a certain persona on the behalf of an individual. And I loved your CSEC quote on illusion. Miriam's work I thought was fascinating, raising questions of time consciousness, and particularly the way in which the present is always perceived through collective pasts, individual pasts, collective pasts. And what I thought the question you raised, which was fascinating, was, can one be grounded if one historicises and relativises our sense of time? Can one be grounded if one treats time as capable of being warped or distorted and not necessarily some kind of linear progression? And I like that idea. It raises all sorts of questions in my mind about the need for us and the assumptions about time which underpin the very notion of groundedness. It comes with a packaged understanding of what time might consist of. And when you start questioning that assumption, I think some difficult challenges present themselves. And finally, Karen would delighted to know, Liam's paper was, again I thought, wonderful Foucauldian exposition of being grounded through architecture, and some of the barren and arid and sterile landscapes that have been deposited by modernist planners and institutions of the modern state and so on. And I guess the question which prompted me, or came to me when I was listening to your talk, Liam, was what might a progressive architectural set of practices look like? We can point to the social housing estates of the 1960s as being obviously not incubators for human self-flourishing. But what would be the incubators of human self-flourishing? And have we learned from the failures of modernist planning how to plan better, how to create better built environments? And what might a liberating set of architectural practices look like? Cam, thank you for indulging me.
So now you understand why I'm here. Right? You have somebody like that as your boss. That's amazing. Thank you very much, Mark. If any of the panelists had something that they absolutely had to say or wanted to reflect upon, I invite them to do so, but otherwise I would just like to open it up for a more open discussion.
Just a very brief comment on Mark's.
Did you want to sit up here, Victoria?
Yeah, sure.
More soft-spoken.
It's really helpful. It's so helpful to have somebody come in and kind of sometimes just get to the grit of what we're trying to say and put it to you in another way that makes you see your own reflections of it. I think when I was thinking about working the opposite direction, I was thinking specifically about strategy points used to sort of work with animals or have these encounters with sites and then take his interpretation and put it into productive flow again. But actually I really like that idea of, hold on, let's think of this in a broader context, because of course Boyle was a post-Second World War German artist, and he was very concerned. He went back to see the shrine of the Edda, and which was a kind of almost, you couldn't touch it after fascism. It had been so perverted, and so it's this issue. It's very sensitive, and here I think with Ireland, he was very concerned about the cutting off from myths and what that might do, how that might lead to a particular materialist, in a narrow sense, way of operating. So yes, it's true. I really did skirt over the risk complexities of the way he was working, and how that set off unease for a lot of people. It was, you couldn't go there. So yes, he would never have used the swastika again, for example, because some people, would look at the triple spiral and sort of get nervous as well. But there's definitely a sense in which he's sort of treading very carefully on this ground and reanimating it, but almost highlighting the fact that all these interpretations are made. They have their history, but they are, consciously constructed and woven. So it's that kind of. I didn't talk much about social sculpture, but this is a kind of sensitive issue whether you should actually be thinking about people collectively reworking their myths and recreating societies. It's the sort of thing that still remains topical today and tricky. People tend to think of social sculpture as the dialogue aspect of the work, of Boyce's work, and they tend to take that and leave the other stuff. But the problem with that is then it gets cut off from the sort of living process. So it's a bit of a hot potato. I'm going a little bit far on my response there, but I really appreciate your putting that, because as a researcher I think also you need to think, well, hold on, am I working with the tide, am I working against it, what ethical position can I take?
Rebecca, did you want to follow up on that at all with your projects? I know that Unseen Scene is going to move to other venues as well.
Sure. Ian made a joke that the Mapping of Joy and Pain could go global franchise. But the city of Sacramento, California, has invited me to bring the Mapping of Joy and Pain to Sacramento. So then that's an interesting question. How do you take an idea to another city? And I thought it would be interesting to at least try one more venue, because I've had all these other ideas. Well, we could literally make a fold-up maps. We could, all these different things have come to play. But it's interesting ethically or politically to me, because the funding would come from their airport expansion. So it's like, put the Mapping of Joy and Pain in the airport? And I thought, well, no, I really want to go out into Sacramento, which has the highest unemployment rate in California, which is struggling financially. It's the capital of California. So you'll go on the train and people are carrying picket signs about the cuts, and it also has the largest homeless population in California. And there's encampments. They live in the public parks. So I thought, well, I would really want to bring this mapping to the parks, to the river, to the Capitol. Then it could be very interesting to bring it to the airport, where you not only see it then as a kind of artifact, but you could also then engage with the mapping. You could decide if it's facilitated or not. But in my heart of hearts, I don't feel right about just taking it to the airport as a kind of, here's Sacramento, you wealthy travelers, and can fly in and color something. Because that's really not what's happening in Sacramento right now. And I had a preliminary visit, and people talked about pain. They were not talking. I kept saying, "Where's the joy?" Well, my house. I have a restaurant I like. Well, what about the river? What about? There's a lot of pain in that city. So. The Arts Commission is now thinking about my coming to Sacramento, so we shall see. To be continued.
Did any of the other panelists want to respond? I mean, that kind of brings up some of the questions that Mark mentioned about producing persona collectively and individually, but also about the possibilities for more progressive forms of architecture than disciplinary forms and spaces. I didn't know if you wanted to take a shot. That's a hard question. I totally. Or how do you? And I was also thinking about the spiral, also in terms of your work too, Miriam.
I just have a question for Rebecca, just a very kind of practical question about the colouring of the map. Did people have to kind of distinctly place joy and pain separate, or was there a lot of kind of places where people overlapped things?
That's a great question, because I was thinking in my 12 minutes I didn't really have time to. But people would oftentimes start with one color, then they'd realize, well, because of that, then joy came in, and so there was, and I deliberately tested with my students the pencils so that you could mix and see, and then sometimes somebody would have a joy and other people would want to put pain, fine, do that, or make your own symbol, you know, color around it, or so yeah, it's definitely not binary. I mean, for some people it was binary, but for most people there was this kind of weaving together of joy and pain. Yeah, it was fascinating, and in fact I did get a lot of emails from people that were like fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, and, you know, please map this for me. So I really did think it would be interesting to do this, like what if the map was of Iraq, or what if it was of Ireland, or what if it was of, you know, where a very different situation was happening. You know, it'd be very interesting to see if, because the returning vets in the States, they're all suffering, not all, but many, many, many from post-traumatic stress disorder. And, you know, it could be very interesting to take it along into some of those areas potentially.
Mary?
Just a thought here, but there's one aspect that underlies every one of the 7 presentations so far this morning that hasn't been mentioned. And that's the difference between individual experience and community experience. So that when we think about ordinary maps, we're thinking about something that's in the domain of a community, something that everybody can approach, everybody can understand. What you're doing is you're valuing individual experience, so that in that process of mapping, you're bringing that kind of absolute attention to detail and personal lived truth, knowledge, and bringing that into that kind of mapping process. Same kind of thing when Miriam was talking about time. She was talking about these moments, these instances that are fixed, and then collectively looking at them as a group. But it's, in one sense, because in the process of making, it's her moments, but when we stand back from them and look at this as an artwork, as an installation, it becomes something that's more put back into a communal terms. It's using the artifact or the object, the artwork, to reflect upon the kind of collective process of time. Same kind of thing in both architectural and narrative terms, in thinking about how that individual element of experience, or how we write our own stories or record our own experiences. And in the idea about the approach to the sacred, or the metaphysical in my case, one can't explain everything. You know, if you understand it through a lived experience, there are some things that happen that only somebody else who's had a similar type of experience can understand. But you can't necessarily assume that knowledge, or you can't necessarily package that knowledge that takes it more from a kind of individual realm of phenomenology, let's say, that kind of sense about individual lived experience, and put it into a community, unless there's this kind of somehow shared or coded or presented way of going backwards and forwards between the individual experience and the community experience.
It's a nice comment. We have a question in the back. Also, David Smith's work deals with individual and collective and communal storytelling. So actually, I do think that that is a theme that we're going to want to revisit throughout. So Ronan and then Mick.
Yeah, no, just a so it's partially a response to Mark's comments as well. I think that notion of, you know, the individual and collective is very interesting. It's kind of the difference between also bottom up and a top down approach to the world in terms of time and space, but also in relation to sort of things like the sacred and profane, the spiritual and secular. I've been working with some people in Glasgow as well, Chris Fowler and Alvin Madral, and New Spiritualities work, which kind of responds to what you're saying. There's this notion that you need to move a little bit away from the notion of a coherent response to something to actually being quite incoherent. But actually incoherent is fine, because that's actually how a lot of people negotiate the world. And just one fact, I was really interested that you and Miriam as well, so Mary, yourself and Miriam, are both using pins. In Holy Wells, pins were a huge item, and rags as well, both of which were specific symbolic items used considerably in both forms. So I'll talk to you about that afterwards.
I'm going to take the permission of conviviality to kind of push maybe a critical provocation. I think you have a lot more in common across those presentations than just the things you identified. I think one of the things that's in play is therapeutic discourse of the self. which oscillates between an uninterrogated kind of atomized individual and some nebulously construed the collective, the communal, or whatever. And it seems to me that there's a series of mediations that are really critical. The way we've inherited those mediations historically is the social, the political, the economic, the cultural, and so forth. I don't think we can take those mediations as absolutely given and fixed, but I do think there's certain moments of the analysis that are really absent here. And I would go back to this production of the therapeutic self and see this as precisely a construct of the assimilation of certain kind of therapeutic discourses into mass media and then represented, and they've now been assimilated into an arts discourse. But actually the driver of this is the kind of the transmission of a psychoanalytic model truth, talking cure into mass media, and then secondarily, laterally, into an arts discourse. And I think that needs to be radically problematized. There's another issue I put in play, which is the way in which certain notions start to creep in. I think the kind of the haunting of a Heideggerian language, the way in which notions of authenticity start to play here, I find problematic, speaking as a very committed secularist. And I do not see that the opposite of secular is spiritual. I think that, I don't know that the secular has a well-defined binary opposite. I think the secular is a very specific kind of breadth of projects, and I'm very much signed up to those. But I would come back to this problem of the authentic and the way in which a particular imaging of the rural in opposition to the urban happens in the background. And that the way in which, for example, the urban becomes kind of assimilated into the categories of the authentic is through this contact point of the individual's experience. And I'd also look at the flattened terms of the individual experience of joy and pain. And I'm thinking of Facebook. Things I like, things I don't like, things I've friended and things I've unfriended. And I'm thinking about the problem of the collapse of our, of actually much more sophisticated vocabularies of affect, the collapse of those, and I see that as problematic. So there's a couple of other issues I'd like to throw in there, but I've maybe leave it at that.
No, I think that's actually a perfect way to invite you to coffee break. Because I think that is a kind of reflection and commentary that is best had one-on-one. And I'd like to thank very much all of our presenters, and especially Professor Boyle for his really wonderful comments. And we will have a performance presentation at 11:30. And do you want us to be in, or do you want us to?
No, just come.
Okay, so just come on in, but we have 15 minutes, so you can come for our next performance then.